Archbishop, when the invitation came in to take the service at Ranville, did you and Archbishop Martin know you would focus on the lives of two individuals, two people who contributed so much, but from different religious backgrounds?
I think we were both vaguely aware of those two individuals, but not because I had been Bishop of Clogher, and obviously James McMurray Taylor had served there after the war, served in the parish there after the war, and Archbishop Eamon would have strong links with the Columbans. And I think we were vaguely aware, but luckily or fortunately the regiment had done a fair wee bit of research to get us started on the careers of these two padres, as it were, and then we picked it up from there. And I think it made it in a way very appropriate for us to go out, that we were there principally to talk about these two men who had come from very different backgrounds and had served together, you know, in those really extraordinary days after the 6th and 7th of June. So in some ways it helped us to focus on what we should say. Yeah.
But it was very fortunate. It was accidental, but it was very fortunate that you discovered you had a lot in common, that you had through the Anglican faith and Archbishop Eamon through the Roman Catholic faith. Two people who contributed so much in the heat of battle, as it were, that there was that common bond in evidence.
Yeah, you know, I suppose it would probably be impossible to establish whether they met each other or not, even though they were working, you know, in the same probably 10 or 12 square kilometres. But it was a time of immense confusion, and as you know, when the troops came on to Sword Beach, Montgomery had thought that they would get to Caen, which is about 30 kilometres away, in one day, and it took them 6 weeks to go really garden to garden. And these chaplains were waiting, as it were, in the background, trying to, as it were, encourage troops, trying to keep their morale up. And then in intervals in the fighting, they would go out and collect dead bodies. They'd take the dog tags off and the personal effects of Germans and British, and send them back home. So I think the thing that struck us was there were two very, very young men. They were both themselves only in their 20s, and they were ministering to people similarly from the age of 17 upwards, and trying to do that, trying to keep calm and trying to help people face up to the awful realities that they were having to face. So it was a remarkable thing that they were able to do that.
The other thing that struck me, reading what you said and reading what Archbishop Eamon said, was the great humility that these two individuals had, that they had a job of work to do, that they set about it with great professionalism, great care and compassion. They provided solace. They held the hands of dying men.
Well, they always had very strong vocations. They felt that they had a vocation to priesthood, both of them obviously, but they also felt that they had a vocation in that particular time to answer a call that they couldn't answer in terms of soldiering, in terms of carrying weapons, but that they could answer in another sense. So they had a very strong sense of duty, a very strong sense of responsibility. And I also suspect, and I don't think it's in any way sort of pejorative to say this, there were probably young men who also had a bit of a sense of adventure. And of course, nobody knew what it was going to be like when you got on the beach. But, you know, someone, you know, who's going to be a Columban missionary obviously had a sense of adventure, or someone who wanted to get out of Ireland to do something different somewhere else. James McMurray Taylor's was probably a slightly more conventional background, but it was very clear from very early on that he had been a curate in the Shankill Road at that stage, that he wanted to do something different, and the needs of the hour also allowed that to happen.
How would you sum up the contribution made by these two individuals?
Like everything in the spiritual world, it'll be unseen until a certain day. A great deal of it is unseen. And because neither of them, so far as I know, kept an accurate log or kept a daily log, and how could you anyway in those sort of circumstances, but their contribution and the fact that they both came out of that conflict still able to make a contribution to the societies and to the communities that they worked in, seems to me to mean that they felt that they had done something that was worthwhile, and that it had changed them as individuals, and that they had helped other people at very difficult times of their lives when they were wounded, or indeed to bury the dead and to have to tell relatives that this has happened, to have to send effects back. So I really think they were heroes in that other sense of the word.
After the war, they went their separate ways. James came back to Ireland, but it was a different future, if you like, for Patrick. What was the story that unfolded for both of them there?
Well, in terms of Patrick, he came back to his order, to the Columbians, and was fairly soon sent out to the Far East. They had a particular, I think, mission to the Far East. That was where they focused, because there weren't Irish Catholic missionaries in the Far East, I think, up to that time. And through time, he found his way into Korea, which was then undivided. But when the communists invaded, he was taken prisoner, taken to the north, and executed. I don't think his remains have ever been recovered, but it's very clear that because communists singled out clergy in those days as being particularly ideologically difficult and dangerous, so they wanted to get rid of them. In a sense, James McMurray Taylor came home and was the rector of Moville. You can't think of a more peaceful spot, looking across McGilligan Strand there over to Struve, and then he was a rector in a parish in Derry called Tamla Finlagan, which again is a quiet spot, Ballykelly, but quite close to an army base, and then ended up as the rector of Castle Archdale, but kept up his associations with, he was a chaplain to the cadet forces and got an honour in the Jubilee honours list for that. But very, very obviously didn't ever seek any preferment. He was never made a canon of a cathedral, which in the Church of Ireland is nearly impossible not to be made a canon of a cathedral, even though he, as I say, edited the Diocesan magazine for about 12 years, than which there's no more thankless task in a way. But he simply, wouldn't I say kept his head down, he just did his duty again.
As you stood in Ranville with Archbishop Martin, what were the thoughts that went through your mind in the presence of serving soldiers and in the presence of those you were acknowledging?
Well, you're always aware of the great privilege that being asked to do that sort of thing in very sensitive circumstances and with people where emotions are quite high. So you had this range of people from young cadets of 16, 17 years of age through to the regimental sergeant major, who would be a fairly big guy, who'd been round a corner or two and wasn't going to be, easily moved, to the colonel of the regiment, General Weir. And you're simply aware that your words have to be well chosen, and you hope, in the sense that the occasion carries it. But until you get to the occasion, you don't realise what it's going to be like. You sit down at a desk and write these words, and you're never quite certain, especially when you're outdoors, that you're somewhere of completely different context, how these words will work. To some degree, you depend on the fact that the Holy Spirit's going to be there to help you, as it were. But it was extremely moving to see that people were extremely moved. And that was very obvious by the reaction during the service and after the service, that people came up to both Archbishop Eamon and said how much it had meant to them for different reasons. Different people had different reasons. Some people undoubtedly from the nationalist community whose parents or grandparents had been involved in the war and who had felt that really it hadn't been suitably even acknowledged in the past, felt that that was a big moment for them. And it was tremendously, I think, important that Archbishop Eamon was able to say that, both in the service and in the interviews that we had done, the television and radio interviews that we had done. And just for people to say that it's in one sense, the church is there not to endorse war, as it were, but to witness to the courage of the people who fought and who died or who survived and who were damaged in that war.
How striking was it that you and Archbishop Eamon conducted an ecumenical service? Was that remarked upon? Was that regarded as exceptional or part of a growing normality, as it were, between the two churches?
Well, I think he and I do a lot together. Anything that we can do together, we will do together. So it's in the normal run of things, it's not that newsworthy, for want of a better word, because we've done it so often. But I think in the context of a commemoration of the Second World War, and particularly when there are still veterans alive, and we don't know how much longer that will go on, it was probably far more important than Archbishop and Eamon and I recognise, far more important for the soldiers and for the army that we were there to, as it were, say things about those two men particularly, but also about the spiritual atmosphere around war.
The words you use, some of the words you use to encapsulate or summarise, you said these were extraordinary, ordinary people. That really sums it up.
Yeah, well, I still think that generation were extraordinary, ordinary people, because, and that doesn't mean they were all plaster saints. It doesn't mean that they didn't do anything wrong or didn't make mistakes or whatever. But as I said in that sermon, I had grown up in this community where there were a lot of houses was being built for ex-servicemen, and particularly for disabled ex-servicemen. So a lot of the people that I grew up along with, their fathers, like my, had one arm or one leg, or had lost both limbs, as it were, an arm and a leg, but they were immensely positive people. They contributed to the building up of those societies, and as I said, they were the generation who built the welfare state. They were the generation who, you would have thought after the war, when everybody was broke, I mean, the country was broke and people were broke in terms of finance, but nevertheless they committed to building a society which cared for people, when they were sick, and educated people and housed them decently, which was not the case after the First War, but also who knew the importance of community, knew the importance of people working together. Now, they weren't a particularly in and out of one another's houses type people, but they were those who read that common effort was needed to build anything.
Archbishop John, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.